This is Nikki Candian coming to you from www.westcoasttruth.com, and you're listening to The West Coast Truth with your host, Russell Scott.
Today, our fellow citizens have life, our freedom, a series of identity terrorist attacks. The victims were their bodies, their offices, secretaries of the military officials, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by despicable acts of life. The pictures of airplanes flying in the mountains, soldiers confessing, flickering disbelief, terrible sadness, quiet,
On tonight's program, 9/11 truther, Todd Fletcher.
Todd Fletcher, welcome to the West Coast Truth.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Todd, tell the audience who you are and why you're on the show today.
Well, I'm someone who's been involved in the 9/11 Truth movement for 10 years, and I'm on the show because you've invited me, and I'm grateful to you. I've, since 2004, since the autumn of 2004, I've worked with David Ray Griffin and helped him produce his books. I haven't written his books or anything like it, nor even been a major researcher. He does almost all of his own research, but I've helped him with making the texts as perfect as possible, as error-free as possible, and my first book that I worked on him with was the 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, which was his second book. It followed his epic-making book, The New Pearl Harbor, which went viral in print form and was translated into several languages. So starting with his second book, I've helped him on all of his 9/11 books. So because of that opportunity, I've managed to, remain plugged into all of the new kinds of information that have come out, the research that's been done. And but myself, I had decided that 9/11 was an inside job before I ever read any of David Ray Griffin's writings on 9/11. I was, alarmed at the time and saw all kinds of strange facts that didn't fit with the official explanation right from the beginning. And so right from the very week, right from the next day after 9/11, I was looking at the information carefully and collecting information, and I began to write about the subject in early 2002. My first article was in January 2002.
What is the 9/11 movement, or the 9/11 Truth movement?
Well, it's a global movement of people who have looked at as much of the evidence concerning the attacks of that day as they can get their hands on, and looked at it carefully, and have decided that rather than it having been a conspiracy of 19 Arabs who were managed from a cave in Afghanistan by Osama Bin Ladin, that it actually was a conspiracy that was orchestrated by elements within the U.S. government with assistance from elements in other governments around the world. And because of the seriousness of the events and their massive influence on the world since that time, the launching of wars, supposedly in response to the attacks, the rooting out of terror, the global war on terror, all of this, the thousands, even millions of people whose lives have been lost as a result of this, it's an issue of very great importance to the people who have gotten involved in this movement. We have made it our principal focus because we see its impact on all aspects of life. And it's the movement to learn what really happened has become a global one. So we have active members all over the world, and our numbers are in the millions. And we're hoping, that we can bring the truth of the events into the public discussion and get some changes made in government policy and like that.
What is the official story of 9/11?
Well, the official story is that it was an unexpected attack carried out by fundamentalist Islamists, managed by an organization called Al-Qaeda, controlled by Osama Bin Ladin, and that was caught off guard, that the air defenses were simply outfoxed, that these hijackers who hijacked 4 commercial airliners were able to fly them into 3 major buildings, causing terrible damage and loss of life, and that a 4th one was taken back by the passengers and crashed into the ground intentionally to prevent it from being flown by the hijackers into yet another building, perhaps the White House or the Capitol building. This is the official story. The problem with it is that there's a massive amount of evidence that contradicts it, and the more closely you look at the evidence, the more convincing an alternative interpretation of that evidence becomes, and that is that it could only have been, and there are plenty of indications that it was carried out by the people in charge of the White House and the Pentagon, people like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, General Richard Myers, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, many others who could be named. And the purpose was to launch wars that had been planned long before. The war on Afghanistan was planned long before 9/11. Couldn't possibly have been launched so quickly had it not been planned long ahead. In fact, the Taliban were told in the summer that if they didn't change their policies regarding a pipeline that U.S. corporation wanted to put across Afghanistan, that the bombs would start falling before the first snows in October. Well, of course, the bombs did start falling just immediately before the first snows in October. So there are all kinds of evidence. We could talk about it at length.
Well, let's start with the towers. What happened there? I mean, I saw a plane crash into the World Trade Center, and it went down.
Yes, we've all seen videos of airliners crashing into the 2 towers and the towers going down. The official explanation of why the towers went down is that these airliners damaged the buildings very severely when they struck them by cutting columns, support columns that were part of the structure of the building, and that the fuel from the planes in exploding and burning inside the buildings and lighting other materials in the buildings on fire, that the combination of this structural damage from the strikes and the fires weakened the buildings sufficiently for them to come down in that very rapid manner that we saw. It's quite a spectacular collapse of those 2 buildings. There's been an attempt by the government over the years to provide some kind of support for this, and there's a government agency, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that has produced reports, a series of reports, explaining, they claim, how the buildings came down. But their scenario, their explanation has not stood up well against the scrutiny of people who have looked at them closely. This is also true of the 3rd building, WTC7. This is a 47-story building that was not hit by a plane, and it also collapsed, and in fact it collapsed. It's also been shown in videos, and it looks like a classic controlled demolition with a very symmetrical collapse starting from the bottom and the building simply falling straight down into its footprint with the roof remaining level as it falls, and even falling at what's called free fall, the gravitational rate. And this is a fact that has been established, that the building did indeed do that for a portion of its fall. Over 2 seconds of it was at free fall. And NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, has admitted that the building fell at free fall. Well, this is only possible if the supporting columns had been cut and all the support removed so that the upper portion could fall on the lower portion. And a very similar, somewhat different process took place with the towers. the collapses of the towers, if you watch the videos carefully, didn't start at the bottom. They started from the places where the planes struck, or approximately near where the planes struck, and worked their way both up and down from those two locations. Nevertheless, these buildings, they didn't fall at free fall, but they fell very close to free fall. They fell at about 2/3 of free fall, which is amazingly fast, so that they fell in approximately 15, 16 seconds, something like that. This is an amazingly fast collapse of these buildings, and of course they look very explosive. If you look at those videos, you see massive explosions of gray material just blasting out sideways in all directions. That's not, your typical, what you think of as a building collapse.
But this is not necessarily proof of a conspiracy. They could have done this in advance.
Who? The Al-Qaeda?
Yes, the alleged, assuming the official story is true.
Well, actually, that's a very hard inference to make. How would Al-Qaeda operatives have gotten inside the buildings to enable them to be destroyed by controlled demolition?
Well, how would government agents get in there?
Actually, it turns out that the company that provides security for the buildings at the World Trade Center had two members of the Bush family on their board of directors. There's Wirt Walker III, is a cousin of President George W. Bush, and his brother Marvin Bush also was on the board of directors. So the companies had different names. One of the names was Securacom. I can't remember at the moment what the other name was, but there's an interesting level of access there of very highly placed people in the U.S. government to the actual security for the buildings. And there are people who've come forward and described how the power was turned off at the buildings for extensive periods of time. The strange people were unknown people were able to come in and out, supposedly doing upgrades of different systems in the building. But there were opportunities for people to enter the building under abnormal conditions just prior to 9/11.
Thermite, didn't they use thermite to cut the columns or something?
Yes, there's evidence that careful scientific analysis has been done on dust from the WTC collected immediately after the collapses of the buildings that day or very soon after. And these high-level analyses of the dust have found active thermitic material is the term that's used. This is unignited thermite, which is a high-grade military explosive, and in fact this is so high-grade it's nanothermite, which is only produced in the highest level government laboratories. And essentially it's a Pentagon special explosive type, and there are large quantities of unignited active nanothermitic material in the dust, and it's in all the dust samples that have been examined. So now getting back to the planes, if the buildings were wired for demolition, then the role of the planes would have been to provide the spectacle that would convince people that the buildings were brought down in a different manner. So the buildings are there to provide a different story for why the buildings came down. And so they're essentially a diversionary element here. The buildings themselves were incredibly strong. No steel-framed skyscrapers in the history of the world had ever fallen due to fire. And many skyscrapers had burned for much, much longer times with much more intense and wide-scale fires within them, and still they had not fallen. They had not even, the frames, the steel frames, the vertical columns and the horizontal members hadn't even weakened after these long periods of intense fire. But here at the World Trade Center on one day, September 11th, 2001, 3 steel frame skyscrapers collapsed into their footprints very close to free fall speed. But the buildings, their structure not only are steel frame skyscrapers resistant to fire, but these buildings were specifically designed to withstand having been struck by airliners. Because they're so tall, the designers understood that accidents could happen and that the buildings could be struck by planes, by accident or not. But in any case, they had to be built to withstand something like that, for them not to fall over or to collapse should something like that happen. It wasn't unthinkable that something like that might happen. And so they were built very much like a lattice. That is, they had hundreds. The two towers had hundreds of vertical columns around the perimeter, and then a core of much more massive columns. Also, I forget the exact number, but many of them, and very, very thick. And then these were all interlinked by horizontal steel members. And the thing is basically like a screen door, so that if a plane did penetrate it, it would only damage the immediate location that it struck. And this, for example, if you took a rock and threw it through a screen door, it would drive a hole right through the door, but the door would not collapse because the damage would be focused in that one location, and the structure of the door would be completely undamaged by the fact that it had been penetrated by a fast-moving object. So the same with these buildings. So I think
you mentioned three towers. World Trade Center 7 is the third one that no one ever tends to think about. I'm glad you mentioned it. And after the break, let's talk about World Trade Center 7.
Sure.
Okay. So we'll take a break, and we'll be back in 2 minutes with today's guest, Todd Fletcher.
3:30 in the morning, not a soul in sight. The city's looking like a ghost town on a moonlit summer night. Raindrops on the windshield, there's a storm moving in.
What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is the first decentralized digital currency. Bitcoins are digital coins you can send through the internet. Compared to other alternatives, Bitcoins have a number of advantages. Bitcoins are transferred directly from person to person via the net without going through a bank or clearinghouse. This means that the fees are much lower, you can use them in every country, your account cannot be frozen, and there are no prerequisites or arbitrary limits. Let's look at how it works. Bitcoins are generated all over the internet by anybody running a free application called a Bitcoin miner. Mining requires a certain amount of work for each block of coins. This amount is automatically adjusted by the network such that Bitcoins are always created at a predictable and limited rate. Your Bitcoins are stored in your digital wallet, which might look familiar if you use online banking. When you transfer Bitcoins, an electronic signature is added. After a few minutes, the transaction is verified by a miner and permanently and anonymously stored in the network. The Bitcoin software is completely open source and anybody can review the code. Bitcoin is changing finance the same way the web changed publishing. When everyone has access to a global market, great ideas flourish. Let's look at some examples of how Bitcoins are already used today. You can purchase video games, gifts, books, servers, and alpaca socks. Several currency exchanges exist where you can trade your Bitcoins for dollars, euros, and more. Bitcoins are a great way for small businesses and freelancers to get noticed. It doesn't cost anything to start accepting them, there are no chargebacks or fees, and you'll get additional business from the Bitcoin economy. For your first Bitcoins and more information, visit weusecoins.com.
We're back with Todd Fletcher. Todd, tell me about World Trade Center 7 and why it's important.
Well, World Trade Center 7 is very important. This was the 47-story tower that collapsed at 5:20 in the afternoon, straight into its footprint in just over 6 seconds. But it's important for a lot of reasons. For one, it's been the most difficult for the defenders of the official account to provide an even remotely plausible explanation of what happened there. NIST was tasked with providing the official explanation of what happened at WTC7, and it could not produce one even to its own satisfaction for years. And in fact, it didn't issue its final report on the building until November 2008. It took an amazingly long time for them to come up with anything that even passed their very low standard for a scientific explanation. And I would mention, before getting into the details of it, that there's a very fine book been written just on the subject of World Trade Center 7. It's called The Mysterious Collapse of World Trade Center 7 by David Ray Griffin. And in this book, he surveys what NIST presents as the explanation, and he surveys the critical responses to this explanation by a wide range of scientists in the 9/11 Truth movement. And it's a really excellent book. And he actually proves that NIST is guilty of scientific fraud. It cooked the data. It had a black box computer program it used. It fudged stuff. It pretended it did not have any information on key subjects, and when in fact it did. And it committed several different kinds of scientific fraud. And because it's one of the premier U.S. scientific agencies, when such an agency commits scientific fraud, that's a criminal act. So the book is essentially an indictment of this federal agency for its treatment of this important subject. In any case, this is the Achilles heel of the official story, because of the laws of physics, no building could come down in the manner in which WTC7 came down without there having been explosives used. NIST didn't even look for explosives in any of the physical remains, even though there are laws on the U.S. books that say that anytime there's high-level damage, and this is defined precisely in these laws, that the authorities are required to test for explosives. But NIST did not test for explosives. But the fact here is, the basic fact is that the building came down so fast, it came down at free fall speed. And this has been proven. There are YouTube videos that go through the analysis and prove that it was at free fall. And it's been proven in public question periods with representatives of NIST. And they have had to admit that it has been proven. The building did fall at free fall speed, and they've had to modify their documents based on this admission, but they've only modified them to a very minimal degree. They've admitted that it happened, but then they didn't apply that admission to their argument and change their argument based on having admitted that this occurred. So it's kind of a minimal admission, but it is a formal admission. The building fell at free fall. Well, what does that mean? It could only happen if the vertical columns, the steel columns supporting the weight of the building, had been cut low, at the base, enabling the portion above to fall as rapidly as a stone would fall if it were dropped from the roof. And that is the rate at which the building fell.
9.81 meters per second squared. Right,
and that's the acceleration rate. And it did this for over 2.25 seconds. For over 100 feet, it's clocked and visible on videos as falling at that rate. That means there was zero resistance, absolutely no resistance. That is not possible if there's any supporting structure underneath that portion of the building which you see falling. And this building, as like the towers, it wasn't as big as the towers, wasn't as tall. It was only 47 stories tall. It would have been the highest building, the tallest building in 32 states of the United States. In many places, this would have been, the monster skyscraper that everyone would have looked at with awe. But because it was surrounded by the towers and other big buildings in New York City, it didn't stand out like that. But it is a tremendously large building, and for it to come down like that, all the columns, the vertical columns, had to have been cut. And not only had to have been cut, but they had to have been cut simultaneously, because the videos show the building falling straight down into its footprint, absolutely vertically, and the roof of the building maintaining its level orientation as the building is falling at free fall. So obviously, there were massive explosions that cut every single column at essentially the same instant, enabling the building to begin to fall and then to pick up speed and then to reach free fall as it went down.
But if there's a conspiracy here, Why would they care to have made this a controlled demolition? I mean, they already understand there's collateral damage. They clearly don't care about human life. Why would they have to have the demolition controlled?
You know, this is an area of speculation. I'm not sure exactly why. It's certainly not something, though, that one would imagine Al-Qaeda would want to do.
That's
If
true.
if Al-Qaeda were a genuine enemy wanting to cause as much damage and loss of life as possible, it's the last thing that they would want to do.
Yeah, it's very surgical.
Yeah, it's very surgical, right, exactly, minimum collateral damage. So they would want, Al-Qaeda would want the building to topple over sideways and crush, several other buildings and all the people inside the other buildings. The same with the towers. The towers came straight down. That is, the portions of the towers that didn't blow out laterally as dust and steel fragments in those amazing explosions, most of it sort of came straight down. And once again, these towers could have toppled over sideways. If they had toppled over sideways, they would have killed many, many thousands of more people than they did. So again, with those as well, it's hard to figure why Al-Qaeda would select the controlled demolition approach. Now, there's some other interesting things about 7. It was actually known ahead of time. There are many witnesses, people who claim that they were told hours before the building came down that it was going to come down and that they had to move back. And the building was vacated earlier in the day, hours earlier in the day, and the police kept approaching first responder stations and saying, move back, and people were forced quite a ways away from the location of Building 7 because they were told the building was expected to come down. Now, this is very strange, as once again, no steel-framed skyscrapers had ever collapsed in the history of the world prior to the 2 towers. And now they're being told that the fire department expects this building, they think it's unstable and it's going to come down.
Well, what's the official story about World Trade Center 7 anyway?
Okay, what is NIST's explanation of how it came down?
Sure.
Well, it's a complex pseudo-explanation that relies upon computer modeling and very little physical testing of any actual materials. As I said, they never tested for explosives, that's one thing. They basically say that fires within the building got started because the building was pelted by debris from one of the towers as it came down. Fires started and raged through the building, although photographic evidence doesn't confirm that these fires were large or widespread or long-lasting. The photographic evidence of the building, people taking pictures all day long of the outside of the building and videos, shows that there were fires in the buildings on a few floors for a few hours and never in one location for more than a couple of hours in any one location. And that essentially all the fires had gone out by about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and the building suddenly came down. There were also witnesses in WTC7 and the surrounding areas to explosions, massive explosions. There were major explosions in the morning before the towers even came down. There was a witness named Barry Jennings, who was a New York City employee, who was in the building with another city employee, and they had gone up to the emergency management center on, I think it was the 23rd floor, and found that it had already been vacated. And they started to come down the stairs. The elevators weren't working. Somehow, for some reason, the power was off. This is in the morning before the towers had collapsed, after they'd been struck, but before they'd collapsed. So they started coming down the stairs, down this long staircase from the 23rd floor, and they got to the 6th floor, I believe it was. There was a huge explosion that blew the staircase out from under their feet and left them hanging onto the banisters. And they pulled themselves back up and managed to climb back up to the 8th floor. So there was this huge explosion in the building, so great, and this is down in the lower portion of the building, below the 6th floor where they were. So great that it destroyed this interior staircase. They had to go back up to the 8th floor. And Barry Jennings said that when he got to the 8th floor, it was pitch black, but they looked out windows and they could still see the 2 towers were still standing. So the towers still had not come down. And so it was not a function. This was not an effect of the towers coming down. So there were massive explosions in the building near the base of the building earlier in the day, but the building didn't come down. Then it came down at 5:20. One very odd thing was that before it came down at 5:20, BBC and CNN both said on live telecasts that the Salman Brothers building, World Trade Center 7, we have just learned, has collapsed. And one of the reporters, the BBC reporter, said this while she was standing in front of a live video feed of WTC7 still standing. She was saying, Building 7 has come down, and you could see behind her shoulder, over her shoulder, behind her, that the building had not come down. It was still there. This was about 20 minutes before it came down. So, yeah, there's.
I mean, now you're the conspiracy gets much larger.
Well, the conspiracy has to have been quite large. There needs to have been, coordination between, quite a number of different power centers. Another, maybe we don't want to talk about the buildings forever because there is this larger perspective that you're referring to here. But it seems that that the press, at the very least, that the major media, the television networks, were presenting live to the country as events happened, information that they had at the very least not vetted in any way, that they were essentially reading feeds that were given to them. Mm-hmm. How could they possibly have come up with a feed that said that Building 7 collapsed before Building 7 collapsed? It's very hard to understand. And they have explanations. The BBC has blamed it on CNN, I believe, and said, well, we were just using something that we got from CNN, and nevertheless, these are very strange errors to make.
That or BBC is one hell of a good news organization.
Yeah.
We'll take a break, Todd, and talk more about the conspiracy behind 9/11 and the bigger picture.
Are you living in pain or discomfort? Have you found that pharmaceuticals are doing more harm than good? MedPot Now provides an alternative solution to achieve a higher quality of life with the highest grade medical cannabis in the industry. All of our products are non-profit, chemical-free, and organically grown.
Nice.
Call 604-569-2119 or visit www.medpotnow.com. MedPot Now. The freedom to choose what works is finally in your hands.
What do you say to busting out that trusty old wheelbarrow? To greenery with a full 1-year return guarantee. What do you say we dip into our wallets less and grab hold of the latest tools out there? So we can quit all that messing around with extra steps and get busy turning up our doing dials a notch. But be warned, the low prices will get you all fired up. More saving, more doing. That's the power of the Home Depot.
Excuse me, we're looking for the bridge to the mainland.
To Vancouver?
Yeah.
Yeah, you keep going straight. If you hit Port Hardy, you've gone too far.
Thank you.
Port Hardy. Nice touch.
Islander beer.
Locals only!
Back with Todd Fletcher. Todd, this 9/11 conspiracy, how far up does it go? I mean, this has to be massive. Was Giuliani on it, the president, the UN? I mean, how far up does it go? What do you know?
Okay, well, you're asking me to speculate, and I'm quite willing to do so.
Yes, this is total speculation, but for the interest of conversation.
Yeah. Yes, I think it goes up very, very high. I do think that Rudy Giuliani was in on it. He was someone who knew prior to their collapse that the towers were going to collapse, which is, even harder to understand given that nothing had ever collapsed before than is WTC7's expected collapse. I think that...
Are you referring to when Giuliani said to Peter Jennings that he expected that the towers were going to collapse?
Yeah, he said that he was told they were going to collapse by someone in his administration. Said, yeah, well, this is my memory. I hope this is accurate. That the towers could collapse. The fire department was concerned and thought they might collapse. So he was expecting. He said he was expecting these towers to collapse. Before they had done so, the problem with that is that no one in the fire department would have had any basis to expect them to collapse. These are the strongest structures in the world, and no such structure had ever collapsed. So the claim that the fire department had this expectation doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Nevertheless, he was basing his activities on this expectation. And, he was able to pose and present himself as the hero figure there in New York City. And I don't consider him to have been terribly high in the decision-making, process. He was simply told what was needed for him to know to be able to handle the situation as it unfolded. So once again, folks, we're speculating here. These are not facts so much as our inferences from what little information we've been able to get. But as far as the conspiracy, yes, it had to have gone to the very highest levels, and the principal indicator of this is the military side of it. The fact that the air defense system was completely stood down, that not a single fighter plane was launched and was able to intercept any of the airliners that struck the buildings prior to being struck. And I'm going to restrict this to the World Trade Center. Let's just talk about the World Trade Center. There were these other locations, the Pentagon and Pennsylvania, where other events took place. But in none of these places were there interceptors in position in time to prevent what happened. And this is highly anomalous. This is very unusual because interception of planes that go off course were a routine. They happened 100 times a year on average. I think by September 11th, there had already been 67 intercepts in 2001 of planes that had gone off course. So this is a very standard kind of procedure. The FAA that is the Federal Aviation Administration, very highly trained personnel who knew exactly what to do. As soon as any one of a set of possible indicators of a plane going off course, they would contact the military and tell them that there was an in-flight emergency. And this would be if they lost radio contact, if the plane went off course as shown by radar, or if there's a loss of transponder connection. This is a device on the plane that uniquely identifies it. So if any one of these things happens, FAA immediately notifies the military. Well, it happened on 4 airliners this morning, and the official claim is that the FAA never notified the military in time. And the 9/11 Commission report, which came out in 2004, this is the 9/11 Commission was appointed by the president. It was a presidential commission that was run by an insider of his office, Philip Zelikow, close associate of Condoleezza Rice, and the person who had written the 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States, which made it official for the first time the doctrine of preemptive preventive war, which meant that the United States asserted that it had the right to attack any country merely on the threat, on the perception that there was a future threat, not even an immediate threat, but that a threat might develop in the future. This Zelikow was the person who wrote that doctrine for the State Department. He was in charge of the work that was done in the 9/11 Commission report. And the 9/11 Commission report came up with a new chronology for the communications between the FAA and the Pentagon on the morning of September 11th, which placed all the blame on the FAA and said that the FAA failed to notify the Pentagon in time for any launch of interceptors to have been possible for any of the 4 flights. And it did this based on tapes that it said were made by, they're called the NORAD tapes, which had never been public until late in the 9/11 Commission hearings process. And they said that these tapes, these are raw, they claimed raw tapes made of communications between the FAA and the Pentagon on the morning. That these tapes showed that the FAA had failed to contact the military in a timely manner, and that the only reason that the military did launch any planes at all, which it did, and which were sent out over the ocean instead of to New York City and Washington, that these were launched in pursuit of a phantom American Airlines 11. That is, that the FAA supplied the military with false information that AA-11 was still in the air, had not struck the building, but was still in the air, and the military then launched fighters to pursue AA-11, this phantom AA-11, because in fact AA-11 had already struck the first tower. So this is a completely fantastic story which is contradicted by all kinds of other evidence. And once again, David Ray Griffin goes through this in tremendous detail and concludes that these NORAD tapes had to have been faked, that they were somehow fraudulent, that they had been cherry-picked and perhaps voice morphed, because there was no way to explain the total range of evidence. The only thing supporting this phantom Flight 11 were these NORAD tapes, which nobody had seen until the middle of 2004. None of the military brass between September 11th, 2001 and the 9/11 Commission report's new chronology that it published in its report had ever talked about anything like this. They had all said that the FAA had notified them in plenty of time, and this was always why the question kept being raised about a stand down, because the military for the first 3 years after the events, its own chronology that it claimed was that it had been notified by the FAA, and that one screw up or another had just caused to delay the launching of the interceptors. So we've got evidence there of not only was there the stand down on the day, but then there was a massive cover-up, because faking of these tapes and the creation of this erroneous fictitious report, the 9/11 Commission report, this is part of the cover-up process. So that's very high-level involvement. You've got, Congress is involved as well. There's research been done regarding the tenants of the WTC. Many of the corporations in the buildings right where the planes struck and where renovations had taken place were companies that were involved in the development of nanothermite, that had a long history of involvement in war in the Middle East. And so there seem to be corporate as well as government elements in this total conspiracy. But as far as how many people are, would had to have known the full breadth of it, that's hard to be clear about.
Well, tell me about the Pentagon, because again, we tend to think about the towers, disregard World Trade Center 7 and the Pentagon. So the Pentagon story doesn't exactly add up either.
No, it doesn't add up. The Pentagon story is at least as bizarre as the towers. The official story for the Pentagon is that Flight 77 was flown by Hani Hanjour, one of the hijackers, and that he performed this 330-degree, 7,000-foot downward spiral, changing his course by 330 degrees so that he could come in at ground level on the west side. And there are quite a number of problems with this account. So the basic elements of it are that American Airlines Flight 77, and that there is actually very little proof that that actually was the plane, because the Flight 77's transponder had gone off long before, and no plane was positively identified in any way as being Flight 77. The principal evidence for the plane that hit the Pentagon being Flight 77 were supposed phone calls from Barbara Olson to her husband, Solicitor General Ted Olson, in the Justice Department. And she was purportedly a passenger on Flight 77 who called her husband and said, talked about guys with box cutters, and said, we're approaching, we're going along the river here. She's describing what she's seeing outside the windows. The problem is that this claim of these phone calls doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Not only did Ted Olson continually change his account, that is, the details of what he said happened kept changing. First he said they were cell phone calls from her on her cell phone. Then he said they were seatback calls. And he kept flip-flopping. And then finally, though, despite, you might give him the benefit of the doubt and say, well, he just can't remember or whatever, the FBI, in its provision of evidence in the Zacarias Moussaoui trial in 2006, he's the so-called 20th hijacker who was arrested before September 11th. And he was tried in 2006 as being a member of this conspiracy. The FBI presented evidence in that trial that summarized everything it knew about all the phone calls for all the flights. And the FBI in 2006 in this trial claimed that there was no completed phone calls from Barbara Olson to her husband, that they simply never connected. The calls were 0 seconds long. So this is the principal evidentiary support for Flight 77 having struck the Pentagon. Okay, well, something happened at the Pentagon. As I mentioned, this spiral that brought the plane in at ground level, supposedly, according to the official count, at very high speed. They actually, the flight data recorder evidence, put evidence in quotes in your mind. The government provided what it claimed is the digital readout from the flight data recorder from Flight 77 located in the rubble in the Pentagon. But the flight data recorder suggested that the plane was flying well over 500 miles per hour as it struck the building. Problems with that are that these planes can't fly that fast at sea level. Those kind of speeds are only the structures of the planes are designed to fly at those speeds high up in the atmosphere and not at sea level. So there's questions raised right there. But Hani Hanjour, the supposed pilot, was a terrible pilot. He couldn't even fly a Cessna. Flight instructors for these single-engine prop planes that he was trying to fly were so scared when they went up with him that they would not go up with him a second time. And this was reported in the newspapers.
I've flown a Cessna 172, and it's a very easy plane to fly.
Yeah, well, he himself wasn't very good at it, and he scared his instructors. So it's unthinkable that someone who couldn't fly a Cessna could fly a Boeing 757 with such amazing precision. Flight controllers who watched on radar watched the approach of the craft that did this spiral. They thought it was a fighter aircraft. They didn't even think it was an airliner because they'd never seen an airliner. In fact, the G-forces, I understand, the G-forces required in a downward spiral like that are greater than what such a craft could withstand. And pilots, very experienced military pilots have said that they themselves, after their lifelong experience, would not have been able to fly the plane in the manner in which the official claim said it was flown.
Okay, are you suggesting that this never happened at all? Or that a computer did it, or was running the airplane or something?
I'm suggesting that's a good question. The Pentagon is very complex because there's a big controversy regarding whether the Pentagon was actually hit by any plane at all. There's a lot of evidence for explosives inside the Pentagon, just as there's evidence for the World Trade Center. It's not the same kind of evidence, and it's not as strong as the evidence we have for explosives at the World Trade Center. We've got dust, and we've identified the explosive material in the dust. That's very strong evidence. Nothing like that exists for the Pentagon, but there is evidence for explosives in the Pentagon of different kinds. The pattern of damage, people smelled what they called cordite. There were many people who said they saw no plane debris inside the building, inside the Pentagon after the explosive events there. There were no, major, they looked around, they couldn't see any plane. There were, professional news reporters who said that. There were members of the Pentagon staff who, in exiting the building, said that people got out on the outside and they saw very little evidence of a plane having struck the building from the outside. There was no wings lying on the ground, no tail, no fuselage. Somehow, if an airliner did hit the Pentagon, it completely penetrated the Pentagon so that all of its parts were inside the building, not outside. And then once it penetrated inside, it fragmented so completely that there was very little visual evidence that the people who were inside the building at the time it happened could see that confirmed to them that it happened. One example is a member of the U.S. Army named April Gallup, who was right there when the explosion occurred, and she went out. It was so violent that the roof caved in the office she was in. It buried her infant son who was with her at the time. She was lucky enough to dig her little boy out of the rubble, and she carried him out through the path through which, through the rubble, through a hole in the outer wall, and got outside on the lawn. And she said that she never saw any plane inside the building, anything that made her think of a plane. She was taken to hospital, and when she got to hospital, she was debriefed by FBI, who kept telling her that it was a plane. And she kept saying, well, I didn't see any plane. And they kept saying, oh, but it was a plane. They kept informing her that it was a plane, and then tried to get her to say that she saw a plane. This kind of stuff was going on. The FBI also immediately collected the videotapes of all the video cameras in the immediate vicinity. They were there within minutes. There were videotapes at gas stations and businesses in the area, and the FBI arrived at these places within minutes and confiscated the videotapes that would have provided visual evidence of what happened there.
Yet the FBI says that they have no hard evidence on Bin Laden.
Well, that's true too.
And they have,
that's true too.
I'm not sure the FBI, what role they're playing, because it would be easier, I would think, for the official story to hold up if they said absolutely Bin Laden was connected to 9/11.
Well, yes, but the fact that they say they have no hard evidence of Bin Laden's involvement in 9/11, and this is because on his most wanted page at the FBI website, he's not even indicted for 9/11. He's indicted for the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Africa in the 1990s. But he's not even indicted for 9/11, and when asked why, he said, because we have no hard evidence. Well, I mean, a war against Afghanistan was launched on the assertion that Osama bin Laden had masterminded the attacks, but they don't even have enough evidence of his involvement to indict him for the crime. This isn't an admission that the FBI, wants to make. This is an admission that it can't avoid making, would be my interpretation of that.
Well, whether he's been indicted or not, he's certainly serving his sentence now.
Yes. Yeah. Well, he's probably no longer with us. And this is the subject of yet another excellent book by David Ray Griffin called Osama Bin Laden, Dead or Alive. This is a short book that Griffin wrote that examines all the evidence for or against the notion that Osama bin Laden was alive at the time that the book was published. I think it was 2009, a couple of years before he was supposedly killed in Pakistan. And the result of Griffin's examination of all this evidence is his conclusion that it's most likely, highly likely, that Osama bin Laden died in December 2001. He had been very sick. He had a serious kidney ailments. He needed continual dialysis.
Steve Pachanik made this claim that he died of Marfan syndrome.
Yes, that was one of the diagnoses, was that he had Marfan syndrome. And furthermore, there were reports in the press, the Pakistani press, and picked up by Fox News, that his funeral was held in December, late December, like December 25th, I believe it was, 2001. A Pakistani newspaper printed a story about Osama bin Laden's funeral. It described that it had taken place approximately 2 weeks before, which would have placed it around December 13th. It described the people in attendance, the gun salutes that went off when in the ceremony. It was picked up by Fox News, and so there's actually major media support for bin Laden having died at that time. December 13th is also the date on which all intercepts of electronic communications from bin Laden came to an end and were never brought back to life. He had been continually monitored. All of his electronic communications had been monitored up until December 13th. They came to an end and never came back. In 2002, many high-level officials in the U.S. government, including Rumsfeld and even President Bush, speculated that he could be dead, or thought that it was likely that he was dead. There were reports on the networks about how sick he was back in the fall, and how likely it was that he had died. People thought perhaps he had been killed in the bombardments at Tora Bora, although there were other stories that he had been allowed to escape from Tora Bora.
I'm sorry, didn't they release death photos of Osama bin Laden?
At what time? In 2001?
No, in 2011.
No, in 2011 they released absolutely no photos. Those photos that showed this face of Osama bin Laden all beat up and bloody, those turned out to have been hoaxed. So there were no photos of the dead bin Laden that would confirm this raid on this compound in, was it Rawalpindi, or I forget where it was in...
Wait a second. I saw a picture of the president and Hillary Clinton looking at the picture and in horror.
Yes.
That's evidence, isn't it?
Well, yeah. Okay, no, it's not actually evidence of him having actually been alive. It could be evidence of them putting on a little, doing a little photo op there to convince you that they're looking at pictures of him.
Bread and circuses. We'll have to take a break, Todd.
Okay.
Experience instant relief with the UN method. The UN method is an innovative hands-off energetic technique that blends ancient Chinese temple healing and quantum biophysics with Western alternative modalities. Learn how to access the creative solutions provided by your intuition. For more information on upcoming classes, call Colette Stefan at 1306-584-9135 or visit www.crystallinevision.com.
In every age, a technology is created that upends the foundations of society. The wheel, the printing press, the internet. Now, in a world sliding into financial chaos, a new technology is changing the way monetary systems work around the world. It is called Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a new form of money, controlled not by banks, governments, or corporations, but through mutual commerce between free individuals. To learn more, visit weusecoins.com.
Zombies. They're coming. You know it. You've always known it. That's why you spend hours researching them in movies. It's why you know exactly where you'll bunker down when it all turns for the worst. You've already got your group planned out. Meeting points, food collection, clean water sources. Oh yes, it is an inevitability, but you're not worried now. You're actually kind of looking forward to it. You're ready. That's because you have a zombie hunter living inside of you. Let him out at ABC Gun Range.
We're back with Todd Fletcher. Great show, Todd. Tell me about this 9/11 consensus panel you're on now.
Oh, okay. The 9/11 consensus panel is a new organization that has formed with the purpose of trying to establish what evidence is best supported and which refutes the official claims. So this is the brainchild of David Ray Griffin and Elizabeth Woodworth, and they've had legal counsel from William Veal, and they've put together this panel of people, of which I'm a member. There are 22 or 23 other members of people who volunteered to help develop clear statements of what we consider to be the best evidence that counters specific claims of the official account. So the purpose is not to come up with an overarching theory about exactly what happened, who was in charge of it, who was responsible. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to take specific factual claims made by the defenders of the official account from wherever they are, the 9/11 Commission, the White House, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the major media, whatever it is, and where we feel that we have solid evidence that is a direct refutation of that, we want the public to know about it. So our hope is that by doing this in an objective way, and we use a rigorous methodology called the Delphi method, that keeps us, we don't communicate with one another, we just provide our own personal opinions as to the strongest evidence, and then we vote blind, we vote secretly on each of the offered candidate consensus points, and we come up with very high levels of agreement that some particular evidence is very strong, and this will be adopted as a consensus point. And we now have 18 consensus points established, and we're working on more. And so you can.
Would you like to go through some of those points? And these, I guess you would say, are truths as far as you guys are concerned?
Well, sure, I could. I would just need a moment here to call up the website where they're listed. I don't have them all in my brain.
Well,
so
like I said, this is all edited, so we'll just go ahead and find it.
Yeah.
You can just bullet point a couple or.
Yeah, I had my browser closed in order to keep my processor usage down for clarity here.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll come up here in a second. And it'll just take me a second to get there.
Whereabouts are you, by the way?
I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and
you're on the West Coast.
I am on the West Coast. You're up there
Fantastic.
in BC, is that correct?
Vancouver.
Do you know Elizabeth Woodworth? She's around there somewhere.
I don't. I haven't heard of her before, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people out there.
Of course there are. I thought maybe, with your 9/11.
Yeah. But there's even a lot of issues.
Sure.
Gosh. Libya, everything,
Yeah. Okay, my browser is heading this way. Let's go. You'll have plenty of material here. What?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, with the first batch of consensus points, okay, I'm ready to go now. Let's see, I'll pick out one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the very first consensus point listed is the one that the FBI admits that it has no hard evidence connecting Osama Bin Laden to the events of 9/11. So that's an example. This is very well established. The spokesperson of the FBI, in direct answer to a direct question, said, "Nope, we don't have any hard evidence." Those were his words. Another claim that we have here is about the towers being brought down by plane impacts, jet fuel, and office fires. And then we provide the best evidence that refutes that claim. So this is, you can see these are specific kinds of things. A claim that the official account says NIST claimed that there was no evidence of explosions having taken place in the Twin Towers. So for our best evidence, we provide links to very detailed claims by first responders and journalists that explosions were taking place in the towers. Let's see here, get some more variety here. Then the claim that there were no explosive materials So that's why NIST didn't do any tests, and so then we provide evidence for the thermitic materials in the dust. It's you can see it's very specific.
Are there any public misconceptions about 9/11, but within the truth movement?
I'm not sure I understand what.
So people in the truth movement, they may banter to each other about theories. Have you guys stumbled upon anything that people talk about or have a belief in that just simply isn't true? Because although we're trying to debunk the official story, it's another thing to invent something out of thin air.
Well, are you talking about things within the 9/11 truth movement that we don't believe?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think there are probably many, and I'm not sure because I've probably gone down particular pathways of information gathering and have not looked at other things that I thought were not so well supported. I may not actually be as up on this as some people would be. There have been people who claimed that that no planes struck the Twin Towers, and I don't think the evidence for that is very strong. In my view, those towers were struck by large aircraft, but I think they were done so, as I said before, to create a diversion. There are lots of different theories that people have, and this is one of the reasons that the 9/11 consensus panel has been formed, is to try to develop a body of really well-supported factual evidence that would stand up to the scrutiny of the most hostile. Say the mainstream media decided they actually wanted to look at 9/11 in detail, and they come at it with the bias that the people who are putting out this kind of information are conspiracy theorists, which is a pejorative term. But they look at the stuff that's been collected at the consensus panel website, and they find that it's all supported by mainstream news sources or scientific studies or things that have a lot of credence and credibility. So it would be useful if there were a compendium of this kind of information that wasn't filled with stuff that was less well supported. And
well, what's the ultimate goal of the truth movement?
I think it's pretty uniform. I think most camps within the very broad spectrum of people in the movement would like there to be a genuine investigation. We're trying to do our citizens' investigation of what happened by getting as much information as we can and subjecting it to rational analysis.
Is that legal, by the way? As citizens, are we allowed to investigate things against the government?
Yes, of course it is. It's completely legal what we're doing. Everything we're doing is legal. We're collecting publicly available information, and in any way that we can.
So nobody out there should feel shy or.
No, we're within our legal rights. We're certainly within our legal rights. The problem is now that with all the changes that have taken place in the status of civil liberties in the United States and Canada and Western Europe and I guess around the world after 9/11, using the global war on terror as the pretext, the 9/11 events as the pretext, the status of civil liberties has taken a major, sustained a major blow. We have rights on paper, but it's not clear that the rights that we have can't be just arbitrarily stripped from us. If we're deemed terrorists, then anything can happen to us, and so we're in an uncertain situation. But, no one in the truth movement who's active lets this deter us. We just have to do what is morally right. We consider the issue to be of such importance that we have to do what's, morally required of us as honest human beings, and not allow these kind of crimes that victimize so many people so terribly to go on, without any kind of resistance. So, we're not going to be cowed into submission simply by the possibility that, that we'll be imprisoned or whatever, waterboarded, hit by a drone from 40,000 feet, drone missile, from 40,000 feet or whatever.
The Obama special.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is the movement slowing down? I mean, it's been over 10 years now. I mean, can you still get people interested enough to care about this?
I know that very many people are still very, very deeply interested and committed and involved in putting out all of their available energies. And I think that polls show that the awareness of the likely realities of 9/11 is still expanding and spreading. There was a recent poll in Germany that had a shockingly high awareness. I think it was close to 85% of people in Germany think that 9/11 was an inside job. And as long ago as 2006, it was 36% in the United States, even higher in New York City. I think it may be higher in Canada than in the United States. So as Time magazine admitted, this is not a fringe perspective. This is millions of people in major countries all over the world. And, I think that the 10-year mark that we've just passed does, on the part of people who don't want to look at it, they go, oh man, 10 years has passed, get over it, get used to it, it's ancient history. But these are people who've spent 10 years refusing to look at it, so that's just what they would say, and now they think that by getting past the 10-year mark, this will support their argument. But that's not influential with people who have looked at it. And the trend is that if anyone looks at it, very large proportions of the people who look at it closely become convinced. And very few people who look at it closely decide that the official account is true. All the movement seems to be in the direction towards seeing that the events were a staged false flag operation designed to launch wars that had been planned for a long time for geostrategic purposes and for domestic political control purposes. That there are earlier events with very similar motivations that can be identified, and this looks like just the latest and the biggest of a series of events in the 20th century.
Pearl Harbor, the Gulf of Tonkin.
Right, and there were events
Reichstag.
In Europe, also Operation Gladio in Europe. So,
London subway bombings.
Right, exactly. So we're very serious about it, and, certainly we're not going to be just, throwing in the towel or whatever it is and giving up. We have to do what we think is right, so we will keep doing it. I think it's growing. It's all underground because it's not discussed in the mainstream media. It's very hard to gauge, but if you look at our presence on the internet and the fact that so many official publications, although they don't admit that they take us seriously, the very fact that the nature of their arguments, how their arguments are structured, how they suppress specific kinds of evidence and distort other kinds of evidence, shows that they're actually watching what we're doing closely and trying to, figure out how to rebut what we're doing. And they can't rebut it directly. They won't talk with us because they would lose in any public debate. And they have to smear us and threaten us and all of this other stuff. So I think that we're considered to be a formidable problem, and that means that we're being successful.
You work with David Ray Griffin, and he's written a number of books.
These are very solid sources of information. His most recent book, this is his current, this is a state-of-the-art of his current views, is called 9/11, 10 Years Later. Just came out this last September 11th. His previous book is very important. It's called Cognitive Infiltration. This is about the call by an Obama appointee, a White House official named Cass Sunstein, to initiate a new COINTELPRO operation directed against the 9/11 Truth Movement. It's a very important book. And I mentioned his mysterious collapse of World Trade Center 7. That also is something that, if you're interested in 9/11, that might be the one book to read. It's very detailed, very well argued, very high level of factual support and clear argument. And there are 7 others, starting with his first one, The New Pearl Harbor. They're all excellent, so I would definitely recommend the books of David Ray Griffin.
And they're all available through Amazon, I'm assuming?
Yep.
And what is David's website?
DavidRayGriffin.com. And this isn't he's not the site, administrator or anything. This is something that a volunteer has put together, but it has, recent lectures or articles or whatever, links to radio.
And then for the 9/11 consensus panel, where would I go for that?
Yeah, that's consensus911.org. Consensus911.org. And consensus is CONSENSUS 911.org.
Todd, I really appreciate your time today, and I appreciate you being on the show. I know you're calling in from San Francisco. I don't know if you're a 49ers fan.
Well, I have been in the past.
I'm sure you were last weekend.
Well, thanks very much, man. Russell, I enjoyed being on your show very much, and your questions were excellent and allowed me to wear my throat out in response.
Brilliant. Well, that's what we aim for every show. If my guest needs a lozenge,
there you
I've
go.
done my
You
job.
did it.
Thank you, Todd.